Hello, it's Kim Murden, traditional Western herbalist and storyteller, and today I've got a historical story for you because I think it's a good one to reflect on in terms of how we look at medicine, how it operates, the ideology and the sort of politics around it. And I do a lot of historical stuff because I think it helps us to understand, as my video's called, Nothing New Under the Sun, that whilst our fashions change, our technology evolves, our tools change, fundamentally the human behaviours don't change. We're still beset with our temperamental idiosyncrasies and our flaws and our behavioural conundrums for good and bad. So we're going to travel to the 19th century, to Vienna, where there's a hospital which has two obstetric wards. Now, what's interesting about this hospital is because one of them is run by the midwives and the other one is run by medical staff, there's an observable difference to a doctor there who's a lecturer there, he's a director of medicine there, he's a Hungarian called Dr. Semmelweiss, and he's noticing that the women who are giving birth on the midwife-led side have far lower rates of what we call childbed fever, and they're really high on the medical-led ward, so much so that the death rates are very high. So I just say that childbed fever, puerperal infection, is something that has always been a possible outcome of birth throughout history, but it was in much lower rates for women who had their babies at home. But it became more of an issue, an observable issue, once there was institutionalised medical establishments. So I'll just give you an aside. Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's wife, they think that she died. Historians think when they look at the records that she died of puerperal infection. So it's a streptococcal infection with a high mortality rate. So Dr. Semmelweiss was very concerned, and it became his passion really to find a resolution to this problem. And so he started to pay attention, he started to question, he started to observe. And he went and looked, first of all, what was happening in the midwife's ward. And the first thing he alighted upon that he thought was different was that the women were giving birth on their sides. There's a whole nother medical history we could do on that, but we won't go into that today. But he introduced that position into the medical ward, and it made no difference to the death rates from puerperal infection. And he kept going. I mean, he looked at things like the priest going through and ringing his bell. He thought that maybe was frightening the women, or there might have been a particular miasma around that. So he, made the priest change his practice. And we, as an aside, we may kind of snigger and titter and go, well, how silly of people to have that view. It's obvious from our perspective what was going on. But have no doubt, there'll be things that we are doing today that we think are brilliant medicine, and of course they're working. And there'll be people in the future going, well, they didn't really believe that was working or a good thing to do. We are not immune. We mustn't have that arrogance or that pride to think that our moment in time is the most perfect and the most advanced. It certainly isn't. It's all evolving. So he kept observing, kept questioning, and then he noticed that first of all, the midwives never attended any autopsies, whereas the medical students did, and they would come back and they would just wipe their hands down on their aprons before going to attend the women. And then he also observed, sadly, one of his colleagues who had cut his hand whilst doing an autopsy, cut his hand, got an infection, and he sadly died. So the penny dropped for Semmelweiss. There was something to do with cleanliness and hygiene. So he instituted a whole raft of experiments, getting the medics to wash their hands in I think it was a lime chlorate solution, which is a very high basically disinfecting quality to it. And there were dramatic changes observed in the puerperal infections and the mortality rates. So, on the doctor's side, when he first was getting very concerned about it, the death rates were around about 20% higher than the midwife-led ward, which was down at 2%. So we might think, well, there you are, job done. The results are observable and people will make changes straight away. Well, no, sadly, that's not what happened. He was ridiculed. There was a lot of scepticism. There was a lot of politics played out. In fact, the medical establishment around him disregarded him and did not renew his contract in that hospital. And he returned to Hungary a very disappointed and disillusioned man. And it wasn't, I think, until the 1860s. So this was happening in the 1840s. In the 1860s, he wrote up his medical paper. And interestingly, there was another doctor, that zeitgeist, that morphic resonant field, energy was going on. There was another doctor in Boston in the 1840s doing very similar experiments around puerperal infections and hygiene. So Semmelweiss actually died in very tragic circumstances. He ended up in a mental institution, and I think he was beaten and he got an infection, a blood infection, so died of sepsis, very similar infection to what the women he was trying to save earlier on in that Viennese hospital. So, a tragic outcome personally for him, but he is now credited as being one of the key agents of good hygiene in obstetrics and for changing the practices of women giving birth. So just to say that nothing is fixed, that things happen in medicine all the time, where it is not given, it's not straightforward, things are not fixed. Dogma comes into play, politics comes into play, rigid thinking comes into play, and people, maybe suffer from not being open-minded. And isn't that a pertinent thing for all of us to reflect on at the moment, where we're being forced to think there's only one narrative around the mRNA vaccines, and obviously it's far more complex than that. And to say that, of course, there are doctors who are observing, paying attention, researching, questioning, who are sadly getting a lot of flack at the moment. I mean, I think it's changing, but to say this is nothing new, we wish it wasn't that way, because surely the best ethic is the ethic where Semmelweiss was looking after the women and children, and any society that doesn't do that is in a pretty poor state. And in terms of medicine, the highest ethic is to do no harm and to pay attention to what's happening to your individual patients. This is whether it's orthodox medicine or whatever you want to call it, complementary traditional medicine like I practice. It's really important to do our best ethically and morally for our patients. So I hope you found that a useful perspective to kind of broaden up and give ourselves, broaden the question, give ourselves courage that there's nothing new on one level, nothing new that we're experiencing in terms of human behaviours and dynamics. Okay, it's on a global scale that things are being questioned and experienced, but that's not to say that human agency can always come into play and things will move on and change. And to remember someone like Gandhi, who said when new ideas or things were questioned, or orthodoxies were questioned, at first people were laughed at and then ridiculed, and then people fought them, and then eventually their idea, whatever they're positing, is accepted as the norm, as of course blindingly obvious. And I think these stories sit very much in this space, and to say that of course when we can be open and observant, when we can question and have dialogue, that things, a creative place is met, and things can evolve, and that's a much more healthy place for humans to be in. It's a much more compassionate place for humans to be in, and it's a place of justice and truth. And I would hold these as very important qualities to uphold, and to say things like, I often call myself a traditional herbalist. That doesn't mean I'm stuck in the mud. I will very much carry forth, that flame of things that work, and pay attention and adapt it to our moments in time of what's needed. So, I hope you have found that interesting and of use and something to ponder on. I'll try and find some links about Semmelweiss and pop those below if you want to read more about him. And give me a thumbs up if you've enjoyed this. Subscribe if you're new to my little channel, a very humble little channel, and look out for some more videos shortly. I'm going to go out, spring's coming here. I'm recording this in January, so I'm getting very excited as a herbalist about the growth that's coming, and I'll do some little vlogs about the herbs as well. Hope to see you soon, and may you be well. Bye bye.